That's a hard one. It's a hard one to say thanks be to God for. Doesn't Jesus say it right at the beginning? He turns to the crowds and he says, whoever wants me to be my disciple but does not hate. Wasn't that the word?
That was the word.
Father and mother?
Sister and brother.
Sister and brother? It's hard to say thanks be to God for that, isn't it? So I think the first thing that we need to deal with is how Christ uses the word hate. Because I just can't accept that Christ, who calls us to a life of profound love for both God and neighbor, would instruct us to hate our families. In trying to figure this out, I am grateful for the wisdom of the esteemed preacher and author, Fred Craddock, who notes that Jesus and all who surround him in this passage are Semitic. They're Semites. And when a Semite hears the word hate, they don't think of it as an emotional, angry word the way that you and I do. When does kick off? 1 o'clock or 4 o'clock? 1. All right, so I better watch my time. Otherwise, you might hate me. But around 1 o'clock today, all of Baltimore is going to pretend like they hate all of Miami and vice versa. They're going to cheer for the other team's destruction. We're going to root for their failure. We're going to taunt them when they make mistakes. We're going to yell at referees even if they're right. Hate, in our context, carries emotional baggage. But for the Semite, all hate means is to turn away from. It's not emotionally charged. It's simply turn away from. Now, that helps a bit with what Jesus says. Anyone who wants to be my disciple must turn away from father and mother, sister and brother. But it's still hard, right? So let's move a little deeper. Remember, when Jesus called James and John the sons of Zebedee, they were fishing with their father. And instantly they left their nets and their father to follow Jesus. That wasn't an emotionally charged moment. That was simply choosing Jesus as a priority that mattered very deeply to James and John, and I'm sure later became understood by their father. Not an easy choice to make, but I think any of us, when we pray for our kids, we want them to make the choice of Jesus. And even if that choice leads them apart from us to go do something that we don't really understand, that's going to be okay. As I've heard a missionary say who was in Lahore, Pakistan, who served the college in Lahore and who needed an armed guard whenever they went out into the market. That missionary said that she feels safer there being in the will of God than anywhere else being outside of the will of God. And so we would choose this for our kids, I think. We would want them to make the choice of Jesus. Jesus does not want with him, especially at this point in his journey, he does not want unreflective, half-hearted followers. Christ is looking for people who are committed at such depth that they're willing to let their commitment to him redefine all of their relationships. Now, here's the scene. That first sentence goes by so very quickly that the crowds are following him. Jesus, at this point in the gospel, he knows that he's heading to Jerusalem, and he knows what's waiting for him when he gets there. He is facing death. But none of those in the crowd that are following him have any idea that this is what's going on. If they're even aware at all, it's not connecting. To them, as he moves out of the town where he was just ministering and begins this journey, you can imagine that as he goes, somebody comes out and follows him, and they wave to somebody else, and they come out, and all of a sudden it starts to feel like a parade. And who doesn't love a parade? They're all just following Jesus out of town. And it feels kind of like, an excuse to stop kneading the bread and stop mending the nets and put all your work down for a minute because, look, the whole town is out here following Jesus down the road. It looks and feels like a parade, a moving party, a good reason to play hooky and skip work. Now, if you are trying to start a movement to change the world, then this crowd of people are perhaps the worst people to have on your side. You don't need people who are only there for the fun of it. You need people who are committed. If you are trying to get everyone to change the world that they themselves have created and participate in, with wars and famines and greed and slavery and more than enough of our irrational hate to justify the exclusion, oppression, and even the death of others, if you are trying to change these things in the world, you need people who are with you 100%. If you're trying to get all these things that are not of God out of the world's process so that things are on earth as they are in heaven, you don't want folks who are just looking for an excuse to put down their work and join in a community to have a bit of fun. You need people who are willing to turn from their way of life and follow Christ no matter the cost. What company would hire a sales force that isn't sold on their product? What good would that be to have people who are just like, buy it, don't buy it, I don't care? What coach would fill the bench with players who put in little effort and have no heart? I know that frustrates you, Eric, when you see talent and they aren't working at it. What political leader would appoint men and women who aren't fully on board with that leader's way of thinking? And what church would accept as members those who consider the mission an afterthought? There's a new church startup. I guess it's not so new anymore. It's been around for a few years. It's in Pittsburgh. It's called Hot Metal Bridge. And Hot Metal Bridge is the name of a span 323 feet across one of the many rivers. Monongahela, I think is the river that it crosses in Pittsburgh. And the Hot Metal Bridge faith community was developed to attract specifically headbangers. People who are into heavy metal rock and roll, people who are into death metal, people who are into punk. Because the leader of that church knows that people who are into this music are not punks themselves. They're not all just troublemakers and violent people. Most tend to be thoughtful people who recognize both in the lyric and in the music a strong critique against injustice. And so what this leader would do is he would take that passion that was so strong in this community against injustice and point to Jesus as one who is just. And this community took off like you wouldn't believe. And after a while, they turned to the denomination and said, we want to make a charter. So the denomination, I love this story, the denomination goes up to them and says, well, if you want to have a charter for your church, you need a way to make members. You can imagine the leader of Hot Metal Bridge faith community thought, I don't like the word member because clubs have members. We're not a club. And I don't like the word church either. We're going to have disciples of a faith community, and we'll get back to you when we figure out how we're going to do it. And so the leaders of a hot metal church faith community sat down. This is what they decided their new member class was going to look like. You ready? First, if you wanted to be a member of the hot metal faith community, you needed to read 5 books by 5 Christian authors selected by the pastor and participate in 20 straight weeks of discussions on these books. Not only that, but you needed to keep a journal of what you were learning in the books and how it was changing your soul and your actions in the world so that you would become more like Christ, and submit that journal for the pastor to read. And journal, I'm not sure what's happening here, Mariah. Do you have nothing happening up there? Okay, I apologize. And once that journal was read and approved of by the pastor, you then had to take a 2-week mission trip to serve people who are poor in a developing country. And after that is completed, then you could be a disciple of the Hot Metal Bridge faith community. Well, the leaders called the denomination and said, "We have a problem. Can we meet with you?" And the leaders in the denomination thought, "I wonder if they're asking too much." So when they met together, the leaders of Hot Metal Bridge said, "We've got a problem. We only had room for 50 people when we started this, and we have 125 on the waiting list. We need help leading these discussion groups." Leaders of Hot Metal Bridge understood something. You're not going to change the world with people who are looking for a parade. If you're going to change the world, you're going to change it with people who are committed to making change within themselves. A whole lot of churches have welcomed in a whole lot of people who are looking for a parade, for something to make them smile for a moment, for a reason to mingle with the community, for a distraction to the stuff of life. Jesus is asking for disciples who are willing to let Christ completely reorder and redefine their lives, for disciples who are willing to take up their cross and follow him every day. For who in their right mind starts a project without first counting the cost? So here's what it costs to be a disciple of Christ. Are you ready? Everything. It costs everything. Every relationship will be reordered and redefined in light of Christ's love and righteousness. Every possession will no longer be yours to do with as you please, but will become in your mind a thing that God has entrusted to you to serve God's purposes. And every dollar earned will be seen not as yours made by the strength of your own hands, as we're warned in Deuteronomy. Do not think that you have produced this wealth by the strength of your own hands, but remember the Lord your God, who gave you the ability to produce wealth and brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. We will learn that every dollar we have is a trust from God, so that what we spend, God keeps an eye on. What we save, God keeps an eye on. How we invest, God knows. How we give would all reflect the priorities of God's purposes. If you think back to that day that Jesus started walking to Jerusalem, knowing that he would face death, and behind him is this swelling crowd, I get this image in my mind from Forrest Gump. When he's running back and forth across America, and all these people are running with him, and he stops, and he turns, and the people are like, shh, he's going to talk. I imagine that's what's happening here. Jesus stops, he turns to the door. Shh, he's going to talk. And I imagine that they're preparing themselves to hear this. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are you. And then perform a couple of miracles and send them home. But instead, Jesus says to them, if you want to be my disciple, you need to hate your mother and father, your brother and your sister. You need to be willing to turn from them, even your own life, to turn from the pattern of even your own life and follow me. And I wonder how many return to their homes disappointed that Jesus killed the vibe. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.